At 11:30 a.m. on May 2nd, 1960, Soviet military recovery teams approached a crash site 200 miles inside Soviet territory near the city of Sverdlovsk. The temperature was 2 degrees Celsius. The sky was clear. The wreckage was spread across a field of spring mud and melting ice. Metal fragments covered an area roughly 200 meters wide. The tail section lay separated from the fuselage. One wing had broken off during the descent. Fuel had spilled across the ground, creating dark stains in the snow. But the aircraft had not disintegrated. Large sections remained intact. The cockpit structure was recognizable. The camera bay was damaged but not destroyed. Equipment that should have been obliterated by impact had survived. Colonel Mikhail Voronov commanded the recovery operation. He had been ordered to secure everything at the site, every piece of metal, every instrument, every scrap of paper. Nothing was to be overlooked. Nothing was to be left behind. As his teams moved through the wreckage, they made discoveries that changed their understanding of what had happened. This was not the complete destruction they had expected. This was not the clean elimination of evidence that American planners had anticipated. This was an intelligence failure of extraordinary magnitude. The camera systems were damaged but recoverable. The film canisters had survived impact. Navigation equipment lay scattered but intact enough to analyze. Maps were found with routes marked in detail. Documents were recovered from the cockpit area. Personal effects were collected and cataloged. This was not a weather research aircraft, as American officials would soon claim. This was a spy plane carrying sophisticated reconnaissance equipment, and almost everything the Soviets needed to prove that fact had survived the crash. What they found in that wreckage would become one of the most significant intelligence failures in American history and would change the course of the Cold War. But the story of how that aircraft came to be there, what was inside it, and what the Soviets discovered begins years earlier with a program so secret that even most members of the United States government did not know it existed. The aircraft in that field was a Lockheed U-2, the most advanced reconnaissance aircraft ever built. The man who had been flying it was Francis Gary Powers, 30 years old, CIA contract pilot, former United States Air Force pilot, one of the most experienced U-2 operators in the program. Powers was born in Jenkins, Kentucky on August 17, 1929. He had grown up in a coal mining town during the Depression. He had joined the Air Force in 1950. He had flown fighter jets during the Korean War. He had trained as a pilot with skill and discipline. In 1956, the CIA recruited him for a classified program that paid significantly more than Air Force salary. He accepted. He resigned his Air Force commission. He became a civilian contractor, working for an agency whose operations he was forbidden to discuss. By May 1960, Powers had flown 27 missions over Soviet territory. He knew the U-2's capabilities. He knew its limitations. He understood the risks. Every pilot in the program understood that Soviet surface-to-air missile technology was improving. Every pilot knew that the aircraft's altitude advantage was shrinking. Every pilot had been briefed on what to do if the aircraft was hit. The man who had created the program Powers flew for was Richard Bissell, 51 years old, CIA Deputy Director for Plans, architect of the agency's most secret operations. Bissell had graduated from Yale and earned a doctorate in economics from the London School of Economics. Allen Dulles, Director of Central Intelligence, had recruited him to the CIA in 1954. Bissell had taken over the U-2 program. In 1956, he had expanded it. He had defended it against critics who worried about provoking the Soviets. He had assured President Eisenhower that the intelligence gathered justified the diplomatic risk. On May 1, 1960, Bissell was in Washington monitoring Powers' mission. He believed the flight would succeed like the previous 27 missions had succeeded. He believed Soviet air defenses could not reach 70,000 feet. He believed the program he had built was untouchable. The man who ordered the missiles fired at Powers' aircraft was Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, 66 years old, First Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Premier of the Soviet Union, the most powerful political figure in the communist world. Khrushchev had risen through the Communist Party during Stalin's purges. He had survived where others had not. He had consolidated power after Stalin's death in 1953. In May 1960, Khrushchev was preparing for a summit with President Eisenhower in Paris scheduled for May 16th. The summit was supposed to ease Cold War tensions. Khrushchev needed it to succeed. His political position at home depended on delivering results from negotiations with the West. but he also needed to appear strong. He could not allow American aircraft to violate Soviet airspace without consequence. On the morning of May 1st, 1960, Powers took off from Peshawar, Pakistan on what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance flight over the Soviet Union. Bissell was in Washington monitoring the mission. Khrushchev was preparing for a summit that could determine the future of the Cold War. None of them knew that within hours everything would change. The U-2 program had started in 1954 when President Eisenhower faced a problem that seemed impossible to solve. The Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949. By 1954, the Soviets possessed hydrogen bombs. They had long-range bombers. They had missiles under development. American intelligence agencies knew the Soviets had these capabilities. What they did not know was how many bombers the Soviets had built, where they were based, what their operational readiness was, or how quickly Soviet military production could expand in wartime. The United States had no reliable way to gather this information. Human intelligence inside the Soviet Union was limited. The Soviets controlled their territory completely. Foreign visitors were watched constantly. Technical collection methods from outside Soviet borders could not see deep enough into the country to locate air bases, missile facilities, or production centers. Eisenhower needed to know what the Soviet military actually looked like. He needed numbers. He needed locations. He needed photographs. Without accurate intelligence, American defense planning was based on estimates and assumptions. Without knowing Soviet capabilities, the United States might build too few weapons to deter attack or waste resources building too many. Existing reconnaissance methods were inadequate. Radar could not see into Soviet territory from outside their borders. Ground-based photography could not reach strategic targets. Aircraft flying at normal altitudes would be detected and shot down immediately. Balloon reconnaissance had been attempted with limited success. Satellite technology was still years away from operational capability. In November 1954, a committee of scientists and military experts recommended a solution. They proposed building an aircraft that could fly higher than Soviet air defenses could reach. The aircraft would carry cameras capable of photographing Soviet territory from altitudes above 70,000 feet. At that height, Soviet fighters could not intercept it. Soviet surface-to-air missiles could not reach it. Eisenhower approved the program on November 24, 1954. He made two critical decisions. First, the aircraft would be developed and operated by the CIA, not the Air Force. This decision was intended to provide deniability. If an aircraft was lost over Soviet territory, the United States could claim it was not a military operation. Second, the program would be kept secret from Congress and from most of the executive branch. Lockheed Aircraft Corporation received the contract to build the aircraft. Clarence Johnson, known as Kelly Johnson, led the design team at Lockheed's Skunk Works facility in Burbank, California. Johnson had designed the P-38 fighter during World War II and the F-80 jet fighter afterward. He understood high-altitude aerodynamics. Johnson's team designed an aircraft unlike anything that had flown before. The U-2 had wings that were proportionally longer than any previous aircraft. The wingspan was 103 feet. The fuselage was narrow. The aircraft had no weapons, no armor, no defensive systems. Everything was designed for altitude and range. The aircraft could fly for more than 8 hours. It could cover thousands of miles. It could reach altitudes above 70,000 feet, where the air was so thin that pilots had to wear pressure suits, similar to those worn by astronauts. The camera systems were developed separately by Edwin Land, the inventor of Polaroid instant photography. Land's cameras could photograph an area 125 miles wide while flying at 70,000 feet. The resolution was extraordinary for the time. Photographs could show details as small as individual vehicles on the ground. The first U-2 test flight took place in August 1955 at a remote facility in Nevada that would later be known as Area 51. The aircraft performed as designed. It reached altitudes above 70,000 feet. The cameras worked. By early 1956, the U-2 was ready for operational missions. Richard Bissell took over management of the U-2 program in 1956. Bissell understood that the program's value depended on flying over Soviet territory. Photographing areas near Soviet borders would provide limited intelligence. The important targets were deep inside the Soviet Union. Air bases in central Russia, missile test facilities in Kazakhstan, industrial centers in Siberia, nuclear weapons production sites scattered across the country. Eisenhower authorized the first overflight of Soviet territory on July 4, 1956. The mission was successful. The aircraft flew from West Germany across Eastern Europe into Soviet airspace. It photographed military installations near Moscow and Leningrad. It returned safely. The photographs revealed more about Soviet military facilities than the United States had learned in the previous decade. The Soviets detected the flight immediately. Soviet radar tracked the aircraft from the moment it crossed the border. Soviet fighters scrambled to intercept but could not reach the U-2's altitude. Soviet air defense commanders watched the aircraft cross their country and could do nothing to stop it. Soviet officials protested through diplomatic channels but did not make the violation public. Khrushchev did not want to admit that Soviet air defenses could not protect Soviet airspace. Over the next 4 years, the CIA flew 23 successful missions over Soviet territory before Powers' flight. The missions provided intelligence on Soviet bomber production, missile development, nuclear weapons facilities, and military readiness. The photographs showed that Soviet military capabilities were significant but not as overwhelming as some American officials had feared. But the program's success created complacency. American officials began to believe the U-2 was invulnerable. They knew the Soviets were tracking the flights. They knew Soviet air defense technology was improving, but mission after mission returned safely. The aircraft seemed untouchable. Soviet surface-to-air missile technology was advancing rapidly. The SA-2 missile system became operational in 1957. The SA-2 could reach altitudes above 60,000 feet. Soviet engineers were working to extend the missile's range to 70,000 feet and beyond. The U-2's altitude advantage was shrinking. American intelligence agencies knew about SA-2 development. They tracked Soviet progress. But they also believed that even if Soviet missiles could theoretically reach U-2 altitude, actually hitting a small aircraft flying at high speed at extreme altitude would be nearly impossible. Eisenhower became increasingly uncomfortable with the flights as Soviet missile capabilities improved. He worried about the diplomatic consequences if an aircraft was shot down. He worried about what would happen if a pilot survived and was captured. But he also valued the intelligence. The U-2 was the only way to photograph deep inside Soviet territory. In 1960, Eisenhower approved several missions he intended to be the last U-2 overflights before satellite reconnaissance became operational. One of those missions was Operation Grand Slam, scheduled for May 1st, 1960. They were wrong. The mission that Francis Gary Powers flew on May 1st, 1960 was designated Operation Grand Slam. It was supposed to be one of the most important reconnaissance flights of the entire program. The mission plan called for Powers to take off from Peshawar Air Base in Pakistan, fly north across Afghanistan into Soviet airspace, photograph targets across central Russia and Kazakhstan, then continue northwest to land at Bodø Air Base in Norway. The route would cover approximately 3,800 miles. Flight time would be approximately 9 hours. If successful, the mission would photograph Soviet missile test facilities at Tyuratam, nuclear weapons production facilities at Chelyabinsk 40, submarine construction facilities at Severodvinsk, and multiple air bases and industrial centers. The mission was scheduled for May 1st, 1960 for 2 reasons. First, weather forecasts predicted clear skies over most of the flight path. Cloud cover would make photography useless. Second, May 1st was International Workers' Day, the most important holiday in the Soviet calendar. CIA planners believed Soviet air defense units would be operating at reduced readiness during the holiday. The timing had diplomatic significance as well. President Eisenhower was scheduled to meet Premier Khrushchev at a summit in Paris on May 16th. Eisenhower had been reluctant to approve reconnaissance flights close to the summit date. He worried about diplomatic consequences if something went wrong. But Richard Bissell had argued that intelligence gathered from this mission would be essential for negotiations. Powers arrived at Peshawar Air Base on April 27th. He spent 3 days preparing. He reviewed the flight plan. He studied photographs of the route. He checked weather forecasts. He inspected his aircraft. On the morning of May 1st, Powers woke at 2 a.m. He ate breakfast. He attended a final briefing at 4 a.m. Everything appeared normal. He was cleared to proceed. Powers put on his pressure suit at 5:30 a.m. The suit was uncomfortable and restrictive. It was necessary. At 70,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure was so low that blood would boil without pressurization. He walked to his aircraft at 5:50 a.m. Ground crews had prepared it during the night. The fuel tanks were full. The cameras were loaded with film. The aircraft was ready. At 6:26 a.m. local time on May 1st, 1960, Francis Gary Powers took off from Peshawar Air Base in Pakistan. The takeoff was normal. The aircraft climbed steadily. By the time he crossed into Afghan airspace, he was above 65,000 feet. He crossed the Soviet border at approximately 8:00 a.m. Moscow time. Soviet radar detected him immediately. Soviet air defense command centers began tracking his flight path. Commanders ordered fighter aircraft to scramble. MiG-19 fighters took off from bases near the border. The fighters climbed as high as they could. They could not reach him. Their maximum altitude was approximately 55,000 feet. Powers flew 11,000 feet above them. Powers continued northwest across Soviet territory. He reached his first photographic target at 8:30 a.m. Moscow time. He activated his cameras. The cameras began photographing the ground below. Soviet air defense units continued tracking him. More fighters scrambled along his flight path. All of them failed to intercept. Soviet air defense commanders watched the aircraft proceed across their country and could do nothing. They had one option left: surface-to-air missiles. At approximately 8:50 a.m. Moscow time, Powers was approaching Sverdlovsk, an industrial city in the Ural Mountains. His altitude was 7,500 feet. He was flying northwest at approximately 460 miles per hour. Below him was a Soviet SA-2 missile battery commanded by Major Mikhail Voronov. Voronov's battery had been tracking Powers' aircraft for several minutes. The battery's radar operators had locked onto the target. The battery's fire control system had calculated the aircraft's speed, altitude, and trajectory. Voronov had authorization to fire. At 8:53 a.m. Moscow time, Voronov ordered a missile launch. The SA-2 missile ignited. It climbed vertically from its launcher. It accelerated rapidly. It reached supersonic speed. Its guidance system tracked the target. Powers saw nothing. The SA-2 approached from below and behind. The U-2 had no radar warning system. Powers was focused on his flight instruments and his camera controls. He had no indication that a missile was approaching. The SA-2 detonated approximately 100 feet behind Powers' aircraft. The warhead contained approximately 400 pounds of high explosives surrounded by fragmentation material. The explosion sent thousands of metal fragments outward at high velocity. The fragments struck the tail section of Powers' aircraft. The tail broke apart. The aircraft became uncontrollable. Powers felt the aircraft shudder. He felt it pitch forward violently. He tried to regain control. He could not. The aircraft was tumbling. The forces were too extreme. He needed to eject. The U-2 had an ejection seat. The procedure was to pull a handle above his head, but there was a problem. The U-2's ejection seat had a limitation. If the pilot ejected while the aircraft was tumbling at high speed, the seat trajectory might cause the pilot to strike the aircraft's tail section. The impact could be fatal. Powers tried to slow the tumble. Habar could not. The aircraft was falling. It was spinning. He was running out of time. He had another option. He could attempt to escape manually. The U-2's canopy could be jettisoned without activating the ejection seat. He could release his harness and climb out. It was dangerous, but it might be safer than ejecting into the tail section. Powers made a decision. He would try to escape manually. He reached for the canopy jettison handle. He pulled it. The canopy blew off. Air rushed into the cockpit. The forces were enormous. He released his seat harness. He tried to climb out. He could not get clear. The forces held him partially in the cockpit. The aircraft was still tumbling. He was trapped. He struggled to pull himself free. The aircraft was falling through 40,000 feet, then 35,000 feet. He kept struggling. At approximately 30,000 feet, the forces changed. The aircraft's tumble slowed slightly. Powers managed to pull himself out of the cockpit. He was free. His parachute deployed automatically at approximately 15,000 feet. He was alive, but he had forgotten something. Before ejecting or escaping, pilots were instructed to activate the aircraft's destruct mechanism. The mechanism was designed to destroy the camera bay and all classified equipment. It used a 3-pound shaped charge. The pilot was supposed to set a 70-second timer, then eject. The explosion would occur after the pilot was clear, but before the aircraft reached the ground. Powers had not activated the destruct mechanism. In the chaos of the tumbling aircraft, in the desperation of trying to escape, in the fear of dying, he had forgotten, or he had run out of time, or he had decided his survival mattered more than following procedures. Whatever the reason, the destruct mechanism was not activated. The aircraft fell toward the ground with all its classified equipment intact. Powers descended under his parachute. He could see the ground below. He could see Soviet civilians looking up at him. He landed in a field near the village of Kosulino, approximately 15 miles from where his aircraft had crashed. Soviet civilians reached him within minutes. Soviet military personnel arrived shortly after. Powers was taken into custody. He was searched. Soviet officers found his identification. They found Soviet rubles in his pocket. The CIA had provided the currency in case Powers needed to escape and evade after landing. Soviet officers also found a poison pin hidden in a silver dollar. Powers was supposed to use it if capture and interrogation seemed inevitable. He did not use it. He handed it over when asked. Powers was transported to Sverdlovsk. He was interrogated briefly. Then he was placed on an aircraft and flown to Moscow. He arrived at Lubyanka prison on May 2nd. He would remain in Soviet custody for 21 months. Meanwhile, Soviet recovery teams had reached the crash site near Kosulino. They found wreckage scattered across a wide area, but they also found large sections of the aircraft intact. What the Soviet recovery teams found in that wreckage near Sverdlovsk revealed something the CIA had not planned for. The aircraft had not disintegrated. The pilot had not died. The destruct mechanism had not been activated. Colonel Mikhail Voronov's team spent 2 days cataloging everything at the crash site. They worked methodically. They photographed every piece of wreckage before moving it. The camera bay was damaged but not destroyed. This was the most significant discovery. Soviet engineers found 2 Hikon B cameras largely intact. The cameras had sustained impact damage. Lenses were cracked. Mechanical components were bent, but the cameras were recognizable. Soviet optical experts could analyze the design. They could determine the resolution capabilities. More importantly, the film canisters had survived. The film was contained in sealed metal canisters designed to protect it during flight. The canisters had protected the film during impact as well. Soviet technicians developed the film. The images showed Soviet military installations photographed from high altitude. The quality was extraordinary. Soviet analysts could see individual buildings. They could identify aircraft types on airfields. The film also showed evidence of previous missions. Some frames showed targets hundreds of miles from the crash site. The film provided a record of where the U-2 program had been flying and what it had been photographing for years. Navigation equipment had survived as well. Soviet teams also recovered maps. The maps showed the planned flight route marked clearly. The route crossed Soviet territory from south to north, passing over multiple military and industrial facilities. The maps showed target locations. They showed timing marks indicating when cameras should be activated. Personal items recovered from the wreckage provided additional intelligence value. The Soviet rubles in Powers' pocket suggested preparation for escape and evasion. The poison pin suggested the CIA expected pilots might prefer death to capture. Soviet teams also found classified documents. The documents included mission plans, target information, and emergency procedures. The documents confirmed this was a military intelligence operation, not a weather research flight. The most revealing discovery was what Soviet engineers did not find. They did not find evidence of the destruct mechanism having functioned. The shaped charge designed to destroy the camera bay was still in place. It had not detonated. CIA planners in Washington did not know any of this yet. They knew Powers' aircraft had been hit. They assumed the destruct mechanism had functioned. They assumed Powers had died. They assumed the aircraft had been destroyed. The CIA had developed a cover story. If a U-2 was lost, the official statement would claim the aircraft was a NASA weather research plane that had strayed off course due to technical problems. The cover story required certain conditions. The aircraft needed to be destroyed. The pilot needed to be dead, or at least not in Soviet custody. None of these conditions existed on May 1st, 1960, but the CIA did not know that yet. In Washington, Richard Bissell learned that Powers' aircraft had been hit shortly after it happened. Bissell immediately initiated contingency procedures. He informed CIA Director Allen Dulles. Dulles informed the White House. Eisenhower asked the critical question: had the destruct mechanism functioned? Bissell said they had to assume it had. Powers was trained. He knew procedures. Eisenhower asked about the pilot. Bissell said survival seemed unlikely. The aircraft had been hit at 70,000 feet. Eisenhower authorized the cover story. On May 3, 1960, NASA issued a press release. The release stated that a NASA U-2 research aircraft had disappeared while conducting weather research over Turkey. The pilot was named as Francis Gary Powers, a civilian pilot employed by Lockheed. The aircraft had reported technical difficulties and had gone missing. The story was plausible. NASA did operate U-2 aircraft for legitimate atmospheric research. The cover story would work if the Soviets had only wreckage and no pilot, but the Soviets had both, and they waited. On May 5, 1960, Premier Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet in Moscow. He announced that Soviet air defenses had shot down an American aircraft violating Soviet airspace. He provided few details. He did not mention the pilot. He made the announcement and waited for the American response. American officials in Washington saw Khrushchev's announcement and believed their cover story had worked. The State Department issued a statement confirming that a NASA weather research aircraft had gone missing and might have strayed into Soviet airspace due to technical difficulties. Khrushchev waited 2 more days. He wanted to see how far the Americans would commit to their lie. On May 7, 1960, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet again. He announced that the pilot of the American aircraft was alive and in Soviet custody. His name was Francis Gary Powers. He was a CIA pilot, not a NASA researcher. He had been flying a spy plane, not a weather research aircraft. Khrushchev's announcement was calculated and devastating. He had caught the Americans in a lie. He had proof. He had the pilot. He had the wreckage. He had the cameras. He had the film. In Washington, the response was confusion and then panic. If Powers was alive, the entire cover story collapsed. Khrushchev provided the answer on May 11, 1960. He held a press conference in Moscow. Soviet officials displayed wreckage from the U-2. They showed the cameras. They showed developed photographs from the film. They showed maps with the flight route marked. They showed Powers' identification. They showed the poison pin. They showed everything. The evidence was undeniable. This was not a weather research aircraft. This was a spy plane equipped with sophisticated reconnaissance. Cameras. Eisenhower faced a choice. He could continue lying or admit the truth. On May 11, 1960, Eisenhower admitted that the United States had been conducting reconnaissance flights over Soviet territory. He acknowledged that he had authorized the program. He defended the flights as necessary for American security. Eisenhower's admission was unprecedented. American presidents did not publicly acknowledge covert intelligence operations. Khrushchev responded with fury. He demanded an apology. He demanded a pledge that the flights would end immediately. Eisenhower provided assurances that no further U-2 flights over Soviet territory would occur, but he would not apologize. The Paris summit was scheduled to begin on May 16, 1960. When the leaders gathered in Paris, Khrushchev refused to proceed unless Eisenhower apologized. Eisenhower refused. Khrushchev walked out. The summit collapsed before substantive discussions could begin. The collapse had consequences beyond immediate diplomatic embarrassment. Plans for arms control negotiations were postponed. Khrushchev faced political pressure at home from hardliners. Eisenhower's final year in office was overshadowed by the incident. Francis Gary Powers remained in Soviet custody, facing trial for espionage against the Soviet Union. The trial began on August 17, 1960 in Moscow. Powers had been held at Lubyanka prison since May 2nd. The prison was located in central Moscow. It had been used for political prisoners since the 1920s. Powers was interrogated repeatedly during his first 3 months in custody. KGB officers questioned him about the U-2 program. They asked how many missions he had flown. They asked about other pilots. They asked about bases, routes, targets. Powers cooperated to a degree that would later be controversial in the United States. He answered questions about his own missions. He confirmed information the Soviets already knew from examining the wreckage. He provided technical details about the U-2's capabilities, but he protected certain information. He did not reveal the names of other pilots. He did not provide details about bases he had not personally used. The question of whether Powers cooperated too much would haunt him for years. Some Americans believed he should have revealed nothing, but Powers was not military personnel at the time of his capture. He was a civilian CIA contractor. Powers later explained that he cooperated on matters where the physical evidence made denial pointless. The Soviets had his aircraft. They had examined every component. Denying obvious facts would only convince his interrogators that he was hiding more important secrets. The Soviet government announced on July 8, 1960, that Powers would be tried publicly for espionage. The trial would be open to foreign journalists. The trial opened on August 17, 1960, at the Hall of Columns in Moscow. The Hall of Columns was a large, ornate building used for state occasions. The choice of venue indicated the trial's importance as political theater. The trial lasted 3 days. Prosecutors presented evidence of Powers' espionage activities. They showed wreckage from the aircraft. They displayed cameras and equipment. They showed developed photographs. Powers testified on August 19th. He confirmed the basic facts. He had been flying a reconnaissance mission. He had been photographing Soviet territory. He had been working for the CIA. He expressed regret that his mission had damaged U.S.-Soviet relations. The verdict was announced on August 19, 1960. Powers was found guilty of espionage against the Soviet Union. He was sentenced to 10 years confinement. The sentence was relatively lenient by Soviet standards. Soviet law allowed the death penalty for espionage. Western observers interpreted the lenient sentence as indicating the Soviets wanted to keep Powers alive for a possible future exchange. Powers was transferred to Vladimir Central Prison. His cell was small. It contained a bed, a small table, and a bucket. Heat was minimal in winter. Food was adequate but monotonous. His wife, Barbara, remained in the United States. She received his letters irregularly. She sent packages when permitted. She advocated for his release. American public opinion about Powers was divided. Some Americans viewed him as a hero. Others viewed him as a failure who had been captured alive and had cooperated with enemy interrogators. Some questioned why he had not used the poison pin. The CIA conducted its own assessment of Powers' conduct. They concluded that Powers had protected most sensitive information. He had cooperated on matters where denial was impossible. But the CIA's assessment was classified. While Powers was imprisoned, negotiations for his release began quietly. The Soviet Union had captured a Soviet intelligence officer named Rudolf Abel in New York in 1957. Abel had been convicted of espionage and sentenced to 30 years. Soviet officials indicated interest in exchanging Abel for Powers. In February 1962, representatives of both governments agreed to terms. On February 10, 1962, an exchange was arranged on the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin. Francis Gary Powers walked across the bridge from east to west. Walking the opposite direction was Rudolf Abel. The bridge connected East Berlin to West Berlin. It had been used for prisoner exchanges before. Walking across it meant returning to one's own side. Powers crossed into West Berlin at approximately 8:20 a.m. local time. He was flown to the United States the same day. He arrived at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington on February 11, 1962. The CIA debriefed him for weeks. The debriefing concluded that Powers had not been turned. He had not been recruited as a double agent, but Powers' return to the United States was not triumphant. He faced continued questions about his conduct. On March 6, 1962, he appeared before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senators asked why he had not activated the destruct mechanism. They asked why he had not used the poison pin. Powers answered the questions carefully. He explained the circumstances of the shoot-down. He described the chaos of the tumbling aircraft. He said he had prioritized his own survival. Some senators accepted his explanations. Others remained skeptical. The hearing concluded without formal censure, but the questions lingered. Powers received no public recognition for his service. The CIA awarded him the Intelligence Star, but the award remained classified for decades. He received back pay for the time he had been imprisoned. He returned to civilian life. He worked as a test pilot for Lockheed for several years. He wrote a book about his experience titled Operation Overflight, published in 1970. The book defended his decisions and challenged critics. In 1977, Powers was hired as a news helicopter pilot for television station KNBC in Los Angeles. He flew traffic reports and news coverage. On August 1, 1977, his helicopter ran out of fuel and crashed in a field in the San Fernando Valley. Powers was killed. He was 47 years old. The irony was not lost on observers. Powers had survived being shot down over the Soviet Union at 70,000 feet. He had survived 21 months in Soviet custody. He had survived decades of public questioning. He died in a helicopter accident caused by running out of fuel at low altitude. In 2000, the CIA posthumously awarded Francis Gary Powers the Prisoner of War Medal, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and made his Intelligence Star Award public. The awards recognized that Powers had conducted himself appropriately during his mission and imprisonment. The recognition came 23 years too late. Powers never knew that his government would eventually acknowledge publicly that he had performed his duty properly under impossible circumstances. His son, Francis Gary Powers Jr., accepted the awards. The younger Powers later founded the Cold War Museum and worked to preserve his father's legacy. The U-2 incident had consequences beyond Francis Gary Powers' life. It changed how the United States conducted intelligence operations. The U-2 program continued, but not over Soviet territory. Eisenhower's pledge to Khrushchev in May 1960 ended overflights of the Soviet Union. U-2 aircraft continued flying reconnaissance missions over other countries, but the incident accelerated development of alternative reconnaissance methods. Satellite technology became a priority. The Corona satellite program received increased funding. The first successful Corona mission occurred in August 1960, just 3 months after the U-2 incident. By 1962, satellites had largely replaced aircraft for reconnaissance over Soviet territory. Satellites offered advantages the U-2 could not match. They flew in space, outside territorial boundaries. Shooting down a satellite would be difficult and would itself be an act of war. Satellites could not be captured intact with pilots who might reveal information. Satellites produced intelligence without risking human lives. The incident also changed presidential oversight of intelligence operations. Eisenhower had authorized the U-2 program and had approved individual missions. But the decision-making process had been informal. After May 1960, presidential control over sensitive intelligence operations became more structured. The incident damaged U.S.-Soviet relations for years. The Paris summit collapse meant that arms control negotiations were postponed. The relationship between Eisenhower and Khrushchev was poisoned. President Kennedy inherited a relationship with the Soviet Union that was colder and more suspicious. Eisenhower's final months in office were overshadowed by the U-2 incident. He had hoped to leave office with a legacy of easing Cold War tensions. Instead, he left office with relations deteriorating. His admission that he had authorized secret flights while publicly denying such operations existed damaged his reputation for honesty. The question that haunted the U-2 incident from the beginning was about choice, duty, and what we expect from people in impossible situations. Francis Gary Powers was flying a mission authorized by his government. He was following orders. When his aircraft was hit by a Soviet missile, he faced decisions in seconds that would be debated for years. Should he have activated the destruct mechanism? The procedure required setting a timer and then escaping before the explosion. In a tumbling aircraft at high altitude with limited time, following that procedure while also trying to save his own life was perhaps impossible. Should he have used the poison pin? The CIA had provided it for situations where capture seemed inevitable. Powers was captured, but Soviet interrogation methods in 1960 were not what they had been under Stalin. Powers was questioned repeatedly, but he was not physically abused. What the wreckage revealed about American intelligence capabilities was significant. The Soviets learned about camera technology, navigation systems, and operational procedures. But the Soviets had already known the U-2 was flying over their territory. What they gained from the wreckage was technical understanding and propaganda value. The real cost of the intact wreckage was diplomatic. Eisenhower could not maintain the weather research cover story. He had to admit that the United States had been conducting espionage flights over Soviet territory. That admission made him appear either dishonest or incompetent. The incident revealed the gap between policy and reality in intelligence operations. Governments authorize secret programs with the expectation that secrecy can be maintained. They design procedures assuming people will follow them perfectly under stress. They prepare cover stories assuming evidence can be destroyed. When programs fail, when people make human decisions, when evidence survives, the gap between what was planned and what actually happens becomes visible. Francis Gary Powers made a choice to survive. The wreckage near Sverdlovsk made that choice visible to the world. For years, he was judged for choosing to live. Powers followed most of his orders. He protected what information he could. He endured what he had to endure. The question is whether that should have been enough. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from Cold War history. Subscribe to stay connected with these historical accounts that shaped our world. Each one matters. Each one reveals something about duty, choice, and the cost of secret wars. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.